If you were to go visit my seminary, where I studied to be a minister in New York City, and stop one of the facility workers in the hallway and ask them about me, they probably wouldn't remember my name. But if you showed them a picture of me, I'm sure that a glimmer of recognition would cross their faces and they would say, "Oh yeah, that's that guy who was always making us move all the chairs in the chapel." And it's true. I earned that reputation because when I worked on the staff in our chapel, I had this compulsive need to constantly rearrange the room. See, our chapel had no fixed elements, no pews. We just had hundreds of individual chairs and podiums and pulpits that could be moved around and placed almost everywhere. And we had this big black communion table about 10 feet by 10 feet. It took 4 people to move. And most of the time, we kept the chairs in a pretty standard formation, concentric circles around the communion table. But sometimes we used what I called the Pac-Man setup, which was an incomplete circle with a wedge-shaped opening facing the podium. Another time, I had this wild idea, and we made a long river of blue fabric that wound through the whole room, and we put the chairs along the banks. Another time, we had a group of veterans leading a service, and they told us about the feeling of isolation that they had when they returned from war. So we set the chairs up in a big circle with everyone facing out, so that you were in a room of 100 people and you couldn't see another one of them. And halfway through the service, we turned the chairs around and recreated our community. So these were the sort of wild ideas that I always had. And I do want to say, before you think that I was a sort of evil taskmaster, I did always help. I always helped moving all the chairs, and I got as many of my friends as I could to help too, but the truth is, more often than not, if word got out that I was leading chapel, then the building's facility workers would just kind of start showing up. They'd start showing up to help that wacky kid move all those chairs. And the reason that I expect in particular that they might remember me by my picture is one particular service that lives in infamy. It was one of the first communion services I ever led. And this was the crazy idea I had that time. I decided that using large wooden module stage pieces, we were going to build an enormous platform for the communion table and put it at one end of the room, so high that when you were standing on the floor, the surface of the table was 6 feet over your head. Now, the artistic statement that I was trying to make was that sometimes the communion table feels really set apart. It feels inaccessible, out of reach, distant. The point I was trying to make was that all over the world there are people who have experiences of being turned away or held back from the communion table because of who they are. And I wanted to give an artistic expression to that experience. I wanted us to really feel it, even those of us who had never been turned away ourselves. It took 8 of us, 4 at the top and 4 at the bottom, to lift that table up onto the platform, and I think that at least a couple of those guys were about ready to kill me. But professionals that they are, they didn't show it. So during the service, it came to the pivotal moment, and I stood at the base of that big platform, and I dramatically called to everyone to climb up the steps, to gather tight and close around the table, to say, to heck with whatever it might be that is standing in your way. I have a place at this table, and I am going to take it. And we did. And we served the meal, and we sang a song. I thought it was pretty cool. But I have to be honest, at the end, I had to wonder if it had really been worth all the heavy lifting. In this morning's scripture passage, the disciples are walking, and they're mystified. It's been a disorienting couple of days. They watched their teacher and their friend Jesus beaten and executed. And then just a couple of days later, some of the women in their group were reporting something that was impossible to believe. He wasn't dead. He was alive. The tomb was empty. They had been greeted by angels. So they're walking down the road, and Jesus joins them, but they don't recognize him. They talk. He's teaching them from the scriptures, setting their hearts aflame. And still they don't recognize him. They invite him to stay for dinner, and he does. And then right in that moment, he picks up the bread and he breaks it. And their eyes opened, and they knew it was him. He was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. It was the day before we graduated, some 3 years after my infamous platform. And a bunch of us were sitting around in the chapel late at night, kind of just taking it in one more time. And as I like to do, and maybe some of you have experienced this, I decided that I just had to ruin the moment with an annoying question. So I asked all of my friends who were sitting around, what's your best memory here? And a few folks shared memorable services, great sermons that we'd heard from our professors, beautiful music played by our classmates. But it was one woman who I barely knew who said, I remember that this was the first place I ever took communion. I remember, she said, there was this big platform with the communion table all the way on the top, and I walked into the room, and I thought it was so strange. And I don't remember who it was, but he was talking about how no matter what barrier was placed in the way, every one of us should claim our place at that table. She told us how she had been thrown out of her church and out of her home 30 years before, when she came out to her parents. She told us how they told her there was no place for her. She told us how she had found healing with a congregation that welcomed everyone, but nevertheless, every time the bread and the cup came around, she just passed it on. She told us that no matter how much she had found her way back into church, she had never quite found her way back to that table. Too much pain. She felt like she didn't belong. That is, until that morning, when she climbed the stairs of that big platform, still not quite sure what she was going to be doing, until that moment in the chapel when God's love was made known to her again through the breaking of bread. She told us how up until that moment she had never yet fully believed that God loved her. And yet somehow in that moment, her heart opened up and she knew that it was true. And suddenly in that moment, I felt like I had never done anything more important in my life than moving those big blocks around. I learned something that day that I have never forgotten, that by some great mystery, greater than we could ever understand, what we do at this table makes God's love known. You know, Jesus was walking down the road with his disciples, and he was teaching them from the scriptures, and they were talking about everything. But God's love was made known to them when he broke the bread. More than anything that he said, more than anything that we say, when we lift and break that bread and pass it around, God's love is made known. It's a mystery. Maybe it's because when we watch the bread break, we see our own brokenness. We see our own pain, and we remember that God knows pain and brokenness just as well as we do. Maybe that's it. Or maybe it's that as we watch the plates get passed around, we get a chance to see, if only for a moment, a different kind of world where there is enough for everyone and where we all share without regard. That might be it. But as I reflect on what happened in that chapel, I've come to think that the most likely reason that God is made known in the breaking of the bread, the most likely reason is quite simply that what we say is true. That God's Spirit does indeed come down and turn these ordinary things into something extraordinary. I think that the most likely thing is that we are really, in fact, putting our hands on a mystery that might shake us with awe. That Christ truly is our host at this table, and just for a moment our eyes are opened enough to see his presence among us. Those disciples were walking down the road, and they hadn't yet realized that their very world had turned upside down. That is, until they invited a stranger to their table and Christ was revealed to them in the breaking of the bread. It changed their lives forever. It changed my classmate's life forever. And I know that not every communion service is going to pack that kind of punch. But I also know that it could. It could. And I wonder if today might be that day. I wonder what it would be like to pause for just a second before the broken bread touches your lips. Pause just a second and consider the possibility that that next bite you take might change your life forever.